And we do want to make sure you are aware that we are going to begin recording this class, and by participating, you are giving your consent to being a part of this recording. I don't believe the chat will be saved, so you don't have to worry about that showing up anywhere else. But anyway, the other thing we would like to ask you to do is to mute yourself and turn off your video so we can save bandwidth and make it a good experience for everyone, so we don't have a lot of noise in the background. And also please use the chat box if you have questions, and whichever one of us is not speaking will be trying to answer your questions in the chat box. So welcome everyone, and next slide please. Okay, so this is just to let you know that we are an equal opportunity organization, and all of our programs are open to everyone regardless of race and all the other things that you see on here. So we try to make our programs available to all kinds of people. All right, next slide, please. And so I am Sherry Frick, and I am the co-host here along with Ashley Bodkins. I am Master Gardener Coordinator in Allegheny County, working for University of Maryland Extension. And Ashley is the Master Gardener Coordinator in Garrett County for Extension. And we are part of Master Gardener program, which I think the next slide will show you how we're related to the university. So University of Maryland is a land grant institution, which means that there is one in every state, and that has, is a land grant institution, and that means that they have extension programs. And in Maryland, we have an extension office in, I think, just about every county and in Baltimore City. So through extension, there are all kinds of programs, and Master Gardeners is just one of those. And that's who we're representing today. And we are part of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Okay, so this is a great resource for you, as you can visit our Maryland Grows blog, and that that location on the web is marylandgrows.umd.edu. We also have the Home and Garden Information Center. If you want to go and visit that, that has a lot of fantastic information for gardeners, and also master gardeners if you want to find out how to become a master gardener. Okay, Ashley, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sherry. So I am so excited to talk to you guys today. We are going to be talking about pollinators, obviously. I'm going to stop my video just to be sure that we don't have any internet issues, but we did want to give you a quick overview of what we plan to talk about this afternoon. So we're going to start off with what are the animal pollinators and why are they important. We're going to talk about how you can create habitat in your landscape. We're going to talk about how pollinators find food in your landscape, how to attract them, so what plants you need to be planting, and then some very specific things if you want to attract a certain type of butterfly. So that's our goal for the rest of the afternoon. Again, as Sherry said, we appreciate you guys tuning in. If you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat. We will be recording this, so you can view it on our Western Maryland Cluster YouTube channel that we'll send out the link to everybody after the recording, as well as a copy of the slides in PDF form. So. All right, so I just wanted to start with a couple of facts. I'm sure that since you are joining us, and it is National Pollinator Week, we figure you probably already know the importance of animal pollinators, but just a few statistics. Scientists estimate that 1 in 3 bites of food can be traced back to the role of animal pollinators. So that's pretty impressive if you ask me. That's a very important role that they have in our economy and our ecosystem and just in our diets every day. And a 2012 study from Cornell University estimated that the bees and other insect pollinators contributed more than $29 billion annually to U.S. farm income by pollinating 58 different crops. So some of those crops would include almonds, apples, berries, and then different types of squash. So I think that's pretty cool. And we definitely owe it to them to do our part to help conserve and promote habitat in our landscape. So that's what we're going to be focusing on the rest of this class. And as you can see from the background picture on this slide, this is commercial beekeepers. And I don't know how many people are aware of this, but a lot of times commercial beekeepers will actually transport their animals or their hives from one coast all the way across the United States. So a lot of times they start out west, like in the almond orchards, and then they just work their way back east as different crops need pollinated. So that's kind of a cool thing that I just learned about probably 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't realize it was such a big business for these beekeepers to actually transport their hives. Okay, so why is pollination so important? I just wanted to do a little bit of botany lesson here at the beginning, just to kind of reiterate the importance of, without pollination, we can't have propagation by seed. So the only way that we have two options when we talk about propagating plants. We have either sexual or asexual. When we have asexual, that's basically we're just taking an exact copy or clone of the parent. So in order for us to get variation of different cultivars and different species and things like that, we have to have this sexual propagation occurring, and that's going to happen by seed. So here on the right hand side, we have a picture of a complete flower where we have the male and female parts. The female parts consist of pistil, which is the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The ovary is going to what turns into seeds. They contain the eggs. And then the male parts are called the stamen, and they have the anther, the filament, and then the pollen grains. So a lot of these pollinators, again, are going to be after the nectar, and it just so happens that they get the pollen on them a lot of times, and that's what they transfer from flower to flower. So sometimes flowers are going to be complete or incomplete, or some incomplete flowers, they only have either male or female parts. So it's really, really important on those types of flowers that we have the animal pollinators to help us get the pollen from place to place. And just one more slide about pollination. You know, in order for pollination to occur, we have to get the pollen, the male gamete, over into the female gamete in order for fertilization to occur. And it's estimated that 90% of flowering plants do require a pollinator. And in the next few slides, we will be talking about what some of those different pollinators would be. One more picture of a flower head. This is what we would call a sunflower, or a flower from the sunflower family, like the Asteraceae family. And I just think it's always so impressive to see that even though we call this whole thing a flower, in reality, each flower head is composed of hundreds or maybe even thousands of individual flowers that have to be pollinated. So each of these individual disc flowers, that's going to usually be what turns into a lot of our seeds if you think about a sunflower. So each of these disc flowers has to be pollinated individually in order, for example, on this one, for a sunflower seed to form correctly and be something that's going to be viable. So these are just close-up pictures of what you're seeing. If you think about something like an aster or a daisy or even a zinnia, all of them have this very similar setup. And a few more facts when we talk about insect pollination. Some of our insect friends are going to be what we call generalists, so they'll visit any type of flower. And then we're going to have others that are considered to be specialists, where they're only going to concentrate or visit one single plant. So knowing the difference between the two can really be helpful whenever you're trying to figure out what you want to attract, or what you may have in your yard or garden or landscape. The other thing we wanted to point out was that all insect pollinators are going to undergo complete metamorphosis. So that means that there's 4 life stages, and they're going to look completely different from stage to stage. So therefore, we don't only want to have a habitat that's friendly to one life stage, so not just the adult, but all life stages, in order to really encourage them to not only visit your yard, but to really live there and utilize it, and to really be a safe place for them to be. In this picture, I don't know if you guys can tell, but it's a squash flower. And you can see what's visiting it. This would be what we would call a squash bee. There are some bees that just only focus on pollinating squash, and the male bee doesn't really have a home. A lot of times they actually live right inside the flower. So they'll crawl in the flower after it starts to close in the evening, and that's where he'll sleep all evening or all night. And then the morning when it gets warm and he's active again, he can crawl out and go find other flowers to visit. So that's pretty cool. And the appearance from one stage of development with these insect pollinators can be quite different. So it's just really important that as gardeners, you take time to, really understand that you want to have a landscape that is friendly to not only the adults, but also the eggs, the larvae, and the pupa for all of these different insect pollinators. So what are these animal pollinators? Well, we're going to start talking about each of these individually. We're going to talk about bats, hummingbirds, the four major groups of insect pollinators: bees, wasps, beetles, butterflies, moths, flies. So that's where we're going to go next. So bat pollination, this is something that we probably don't see a whole lot here in Maryland where I live, but in other parts of the world, bats do play a very important role in helping to pollinate a lot of the bigger flowers especially. Bats are going to drink the nectar that are often offered by these plants, and that's what's going to attract them to the plants, especially things like cactus and things like that. And bat pollinated flowers often contain a sulfur scented compound, and they have much bigger pollen. So just an important animal pollinator friend that we want to think about. We definitely don't want to exclude them, and we know how helpful they are at controlling a lot of our other particularly annoying insect pests, things like mosquitoes and some other what we consider bad bugs. So it can be helpful to have a landscape where bats are encouraged to visit. Our next animal pollinator friend would be a hummingbird. So most people are pretty familiar with hummingbirds, but we did want to include them because they are known for visiting a lot of different red and orange flowers. So some of their most favorite flowers would be things like orange jewelweed, honeysuckle, scarlet bee balm, and cardinal flower. The other plant that they really, really enjoy visiting would be the eastern Columbine. And if you've ever noticed, a lot of times their return to our area is going to be coupled with when this native plant starts to bloom. So I think that's pretty cool. And it's said that the red flowers contain the highest amount of carbohydrates. And anybody who's ever spent any time around hummingbirds knows how fast their little wings are always humming. So they constantly need, a new source of food. So by visiting these red flowers, it's a great way for them to get a good high source of energy. And this is a really cool article that was just published in the last week or so. It was sent out to our email. But if you're interested, it says hummingbirds see colors that humans can only imagine. And it talks about the UV spectrum that hummingbirds can actually see. So you guys will all get these slides and you can visit this article and read it if that's something that you're interested in. I just thought how awesome it was and good timing that this article just came out. Our next type of insect pollinator we wanted to talk about would be the beetles. So this is one of the oldest and most diverse groups of plant pollinators, and ones that a lot of times people overlook, don't really think about them as being important pollinators, but they tend to really like plants that have a strong or a strong scent to the flower. Some of the things they're known to pollinate would be magnolia, sweet shrub, pawpaws, and yellow pond lilies. So just something to think about. The two pictures here would be the soldier beetle and then a June beetle, which can both act, again, as pollinators. That's not their sole purpose in life, but they do help us with a lot of what we call accidental pollination. The next category would be flies. Again, another one that's not nearly as glamorous to talk about as things like butterflies or bees, but they definitely help us with a lot of different plants to pollinate. Things like the American pawpaw, horse arum, skunk cabbage, goldenrod, and even members of the Queen Anne's lace family, so the carrot family. And even things like hoverflies, they're sometimes called flower flies or syrphid flies. They can also help us a lot with pollination, and their larvae can also feed on aphids. So it's kind of a double win if you can encourage the hoverflies to visit your yard and garden. Another category would be the wasps. So these are going to be ones that are a little bit aggressive to most people. So of all the animal pollinators and insect pollinators that we're going to talk about, wasps probably pose the largest threat to, causing stings to humans. So just be careful with these. But a lot of the wasps, they feed on insect and spiders for their young, especially things like the solitary wasps like mud daubers or cicada killers. So they're very rarely aggressive. The more social wasps like yellow jackets, paper nest wasps, or hornets, those are going to be the ones that are a little bit more aggressive because they are defending their nest. So you have to be careful with those. You don't want to maybe feel too bad about getting rid of them if they are in your landscape. Particularly if you have small children or things like that in your home or in your garden, because these guys can get pretty aggressive. But just remember, they are beneficial from the point of they are finding hopefully bad bugs or maybe even good bugs and feeding them to their young whenever they lay their eggs. And then they also do, again, as adults, feed on some nectar, and they can help us with pollination there too. And then we move into the category of bees, which is separate from wasps. So we have basically two types of bees that we wanted to talk about. The social bees, which would be bumble and honey, and then our more solitary bees, which are going to be a little less aggressive because, again, they're not defending a hive at all. It's just themselves. So we're going to talk specifically about them. We did put this slide in here as just a quick reference to if you are specifically trying to attract bees, what are some native plants that you can use. We'll be talking about the majority of these same plants when we talk about how to attract pollinators and butterflies. Towards the end of the presentation, Sherry will be talking about these, but we did want to leave this slide in here in case somebody wanted it for their notes. So the first social bee that we want to talk about would be the bumblebee. And most people may already know this, but bumblebees tend to visit flowers that are much larger, that are usually off limits to things like honeybees and a lot of our smaller solitary bees. So they provide us a service that other bees can't do because they are so much larger and more stout in the body. They're going to be large, hairy, yellow to orange and black. And a lot of times these guys are going to make their nest in old like mouse holes in the ground. So they actually do live in the soil, and they go through different cycles, different parts of the life cycle, where they are going to have social parts, and then there's going to be some different solitary stages as well. So just be forewarned that, again, they are a social bee, so they can they can be a little bit aggressive if you are messing with their hive. And this would be one that where they need, again, access to soil in order to create their nest and their den. So just be on the lookout for bumblebees. And I will point out that they are completely different from the carpenter bees, even though they look similar. Carpenter bees often have an abdomen that's completely black. And they're a little bit larger usually. And carpenter bees are going to make their nests in wood of some sort, usually like in the under eaves of a building or wood that's not been treated or painted. The next type of native bee I wanted to talk about would be the first solitary bee. So we have mining or digger bees, and I just wanted to point these guys out. They're in the Andrena species, and they're really quite small. They're a lot smaller than a bumblebee, and they are going to not have, they're going to be solitary, so they're not going to have a hive to defend. So these are really good bees that we can encourage in our yard, in our gardens, and even things like school gardens and things like that. And they kind of have a rusty red color to a lot of them. There's more than 1,300 species across the world, but these Andrenas tend to be what we see a lot here in the United States. And they like to live in the soil. So in order to encourage these types of mining or digger bees, we need to have some areas in our garden that is kind of like mud, areas that are not completely covered in mulch or not always covered by plants, so that they can have access to the mud and resources that they need to make their nests. And the next type of solitary bee that I just wanted to point out would be the blue orchard mason bee. So maybe you've seen these types of bee houses for sale. A lot of times they're just made out of untreated wood, and they have a 5/16 diameter hole. So if you're interested in making your own mason bee house, you can also use things like straws, plastic straws, to give them a place to live, or bamboo. But basically they are looking for cavities that are already made. They have no way of excavating a hole themselves. They're not like a carpenter bee, so they can't chew or anything like that into the wood. In nature, they would spend a lot of their time building nests like in hollow stems. So that's another reason that it's important to not always be a tidy gardener in the fall of the year, especially. The more like hollow stems and things like that you can leave in your landscape, the more habitat you can provide for some of these solitary bees. And the last insect type of pollinator that we wanted to talk about would be the Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. So of the Lepidoptera genus, there are 8% of the species are known to be butterflies, and the rest of them, 92%, are moths. So even though butterflies tend to get a lot of attention, moths also do a lot of pollinating for us too. And we are also going to talk a lot about how to attract these butterflies and moths towards the end of the presentation. So how are we doing, Sherry? Do we have any questions we want to address, or do we want to just keep on rolling?
We're keeping up here, so just keep on rolling.
Okay. So we're going to move into, so we've talked about what are the specific types of animal pollinators and insect pollinators that we wanted to highlight, just hopefully give you a new idea of something you might already have in your landscape, or some maybe want to try to attract. So how can we make our landscapes more helpful, more useful, and more user-friendly to these animal pollinators that we want to see coming to visit? And the first term we wanted to talk about is something called vertical stratification. So basically, this is just how you want to recreate what Mother Nature would do on her own. So if anybody has studied much about ecology, they may already know that, it's not natural for soil to be bare. If you take a pile of soil, or you do any type of excavation, and you just leave it lay or leave it sit and don't bother it, Mother Nature's goal is to cover that soil. And if you wait long enough, you eventually will get all these different layers of plants coming up. So a lot of times, 50, 20, 30 years ago, the perfect lawn and landscape, in a lot of people's opinions, would have just been a couple shade trees maybe in your yard and then a lot of lawn space. But what we really want to see happening is creating more of this natural effect where we have a few tall trees, we have a canopy layer, we have some understory shrubs and shorter things, and then we have different things on our forest floor as well, like flowers and different pollinator maybe plants and areas for these pollinators to live and thrive. So, you know, it's kind of gets a little complicated because I know most people don't want to live in the middle of a woods or a forest maybe. But just the thought process that goes into this is that you don't want to just have a single tree and then lawn. That's not going to be super attractive to a lot of the pollinators. It's not going to give them a place to live, a place to overwinter, or very much of a food source. So how can we break this down and really attract these pollinators and provide them with things that they're going to be able to use? The first thing we wanted to talk about was selecting plants that are going to have seasons, all 4 seasons of interest. So I know a lot of people may not be joining us from an area where you have all 4 seasons or have drastic differences in 4 seasons, but here where I live, we have drastic changes from winter to spring to summer to fall. This is one example of sedum, of how it actually can provide food and shelter during each of the 4 seasons. So there in the spring of the year, you can see where they've left some of the leaves and things like that around the emerging plant. The spring of the year, midsummer, you start to get the flowers that act as pollinator food. And then in the fall of the year, you should leave those seed heads because it also can be a food source for some of the different types of birds that we see. And then you don't really want to cut that back because the sedum stems provide nesting habitats to some of the different solitary bees and insects, as well as in the winter, it can give you some different visual interest. You can see in the last photo there on the right, where snow lays on the top of the sedum heads and things like that. So it kind of gives you, interest, and it provides a purpose for all different seasons that the sedum is there. Another idea would be to include some type of evergreen in your landscape. Again, where I live, here in the mountains of Garrett County, we have a lot of months where we don't have a whole lot of flowering flowers available to our pollinators. So by giving them some evergreens like either holly or cedar, juniper, or different types of pine, you can really help to give them places to live as well as provide a food source. Okay, so just consider that. And a lot of these plants, again, are also going to have maybe not beautiful flowers, but very inconspicuous flowers that are going to be either early nectar sources for the pollinators, or potentially provide a source of food for birds and some other critters that you may be trying to encourage to come into your landscape too. And plant diversity. This is really important. So not just with colors of plants or types of plants, but is it a tree? Is it a shrub? Is it a perennial? Is it an annual? All the different plants that you can put into your landscape is going to help add diversity. That's going to help increase the amount of animal pollinators that can come into your yard and really thrive. So every type of plant is going to provide something different, and they're all going to provide a different appealing factor to different animal pollinators that you do want to encourage to come in. And then bloom time is something that people maybe don't really think about, but perennials especially tend to only bloom for one season unless you're out there managing them, cutting them back, getting them to bloom multiple times. So by planting a variety of either perennials mixed in with annuals, or those perennials that are going to have a very long season of bloom, it can be very helpful to the pollinators, especially when we talk about the shoulder seasons. So if you think about really early in the spring and really late into the fall, that tends to be the time that our pollinators, again, here in our area, are a little bit more they need more help. Really early in the season, things just haven't started to take off, so they tend to be really a really hard time for pollinators to find food. And then late into the fall, of course, a lot of people know about the monarch butterfly and how it makes its trek, from the east, upper eastern United States all the way back down to Mexico. So along its whole journey, it needs to have food to eat. And as an adult, that does not really, it's not limited to just milkweed, but it can feed on a lot of different plants for nectar. So again, think about these shoulder seasons and what you can add to your landscape that would really help early in the season and late into the fall. These are some just examples: Eastern Columbine, Virginia bluebells, wild geraniums, and violets. And that would be for spring. And then for fall, your asters, goldenrod, Joe Pye weed, or New York ironweed. And Miss Sherry is going to talk extensively about a lot of these plants and has a lot of their scientific names and things like that listed towards the end. Another point that we wanted to raise would be when you are trying to create habitat in your landscape, the last thing you want to be doing is to be applying broad spectrum pesticides, broad spectrum insecticides, particularly when you're attracting pollinators. So we wanted to just talk a couple minutes about this theory of integrated pest management, which we are going to be doing a class next Tuesday evening specific to just integrated pest management and how you can naturally manage insects and pests and diseases in your landscape. So if you're interested, we'll put that link in the chat box towards the end of the presentation. You can feel free to sign up for that. But we did want to talk about, these are triangles, obviously, and it all starts with education. So if you can learn a little bit about what your problem is before you just go and grab the most toxic, insecticide that you can find on the shelf, the education is really, really important. The next step would be sanitation. So making sure that you do clean up. This is particularly important with plant diseases, especially fungal diseases where the fungal spores could overwinter in dead and dying plants. So if you have, a disease that's going on that comes back year after year, making sure that you do clean that up can be really, really important. As well as sanitation from the perspective of bad bugs. If you can get rid of their egg masses before they hatch, that's a great way to get rid of them without having to use an insecticide that may potentially harm some of your good pollinator friends that you are trying to attract. The next step on the pyramid would be maintenance and cultural practices. So just being very aware of what's going on in your yard. And again, making a yard that's friendly to all 4 life stages of a lot of these critters is going to be super, super important. So I know a lot of people like to plant dill and things like that in the dill family, fennel, things like that, even Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. Those are all food sources for the tiger swallowtail butterfly. So if anybody has ever been exposed to butterfly larvae, those caterpillars, they can eat a lot of foliage really, really quickly. So you have to be aware of that. So you're going to have to be willing to accept some damage to your plants, and it may be that the damage may happen on some of your favorite plants. So again, you don't want to be encouraging these butterfly larvae, for example, and then end up killing them because you're annoyed by them actually eating the foliage of your plants. So again, it kind of goes back to the education of what you're attracting and what the food source may be. And the very last resort should be that you shouldn't feel bad about using a pesticide if you have tried everything else and you have done your research and you follow the label. The label is the law. We say that a lot during any of our pesticide trainings. So you just want to make sure that if you are reaching for a pesticide, that you've tried other things and that you do follow whatever is on that label. The label should have the pest that you're treating as well as the plant listed on there. And you should be sure that you, again, just follow all the safety precautions and make sure that you do know what the outcome could be from that. And this is from the Xerces Society, which is a great nonprofit website and organization that does a lot with pollinators. This was a couple years ago. They had this campaign. It was called Bring Back the Pollinators. So what are some steps that you can do, 4 simple steps that you can do in your yard and garden and landscape to help conserve pollinators? So of course, the first one is to provide flowers. The second one is to make sure that they have a home that's essential for the plant or for the pollinator. Be careful with your pesticides. And then the last step would be to let friends and family know, and neighbors, that you are providing habitat for pollinators. So just kind of a fun idea. You can check out their website again if you just put into the search engine the Xerces Society. They have a lot of wonderful guides and things like that for you to check out, and a lot of wonderful webinars as well. Another point in creating habitat in your landscape would be to supply a water source. We always say that dripping or running water is better than just still water. That's for a couple reasons. The first one, of course, would be to eliminate stagnant water that's going to be a breeding ground for mosquitoes. We don't want that. But dripping and running water also provides a lot of sound, which a lot of pollinator friends and animals in general are going to be attracted to. So that's a great thing to do if you have that resource available. But if you don't have, you don't want to invest that much money into putting in like a running water feature, this is something called a puddling station. And puddling is one activity that butterflies do, and that's how they obtain minerals from the liquid pore spaces. So you oftentimes will see this around mud puddles, or I live on a farm, so we see it in the pasture around like cow manure and things like that, because they want the salts out of the animal waste. So this is a really easy way to do it. Here's a picture of the butterflies puddling, but you just basically take a shallow container, and you would put some compost in there, fill it with sand, put some compost, so again they can get the salts out of there. Place some larger pebbles on top, and then you want to add water to the base of the pebbles. This is going to give the butterflies and the bees, oh goodness, sorry, the butterflies and bees a place to come and suck up those salts that they really, really need. And you just want to make sure that you keep water in there, but again, not too deep, because you don't want them to get their wings wet. So the pebbles provide a place for them to land. Sorry about that. So this is a puddling station, and then you just want to place it in your yard or garden, put it up a little bit higher. If you can put it on another container that's turned upside down, it's a great way to encourage these critters to come in and get something to drink. Another point to consider is that if you can plant a lot of straight species, that's going to be a little bit better for our pollinators. And I'm not going to say that, cultivars and non-natives are not beautiful, but they have often been bred or selected for certain characteristics. So for example, this is a double cherry blossom for a flowering cherry tree, which is absolutely gorgeous, but it's a lot more complicated for our animal pollinator friends to try and find the nectar and the pollen. So again, not that you can't have any of these in your landscape, but the less you can stay away from, more complicated, more double flowers, and stay closer to the straight or native species, the easier it's going to be for the pollinators to find the pollen and to come visit your yard. A good point is that a lot of these plants have evolved over time, and so have the pollinators. So, by putting something brand new out there that they've never seen, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to access. Another thing to consider is that perennials tend to offer better nectar. That's a little bit easier and better for the pollinators. Wildflowers are some of your best sources of pollen. They're not always the most beautiful, but they do offer really good pollen for our pollinator friends. And this is an example of the evening primrose that is in bloom right now in our area. And you also want to consider surrounding your garden with a lot of natural vegetation and perennial plants, plant beds. This is going to, again, offer sheltering and overwintering sites for things like ground beetles and other good bugs that you want to help encourage to come visit your yard and garden. If you have a completely, a garden that's nothing but annuals that you're going to take out and replace every so often, it's not going to be as user friendly to these guys that want to make their home here and make it a permanent place. Had to put one slide in here about dandelions. They definitely do provide nectar and pollen for a lot of the adults early in the season when nothing else is blooming. So, just be encouraged to have them, but don't feel bad about mowing them off either after or before they start to set their seeds, because you don't necessarily want to have a landscape that's covered in nothing but dandelions. And a lot of the plants in the different Asteraceae, Apiaceae, and Umbellifera and Polygonaceae families are really good choices. So, sometimes the Asteraceae are also called composite flowers. The Polygonaceae ones, this would be an example of here on the left-hand side. This is buckwheat. Also things like smartweed are in that family. The Apiaceae would be things like Queen Anne's lace and things like that. So just think about the flowers. A lot of times they're very small with relatively open blossoms. That's going to be what your pollinators tend to visit a lot. They have to work a little harder to get the pollen and nectar, but these are going to be ones that they've evolved with. So these are going to be very useful to a lot of the pollinators. Here's a picture of Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. And again, just some of the parasitoids, so some of the very small flying insects. So pardon me, sorry, I had a cough. The parasitoids, so things that are going to help us to take care of some of our bad bugs, they particularly benefit from things like wild parsnip, wild carrots, and other wildflowers like Queen Anne's lace. Sorry about that. And just another point, just to don't feel bad about leaving some areas of your landscape undisturbed. So I know the Xerces Society a couple years ago had a campaign that was leave the leaves in the fall of the year. So a lot of, especially like our moths and things like that, they are going to overwinter and lay there and have their pupa or their cocoon, their resting stage in leaves and undercover and things like that. So you don't necessarily want to have a really clean yard and garden all the time, because you're going to be cleaning up some of the overwintering stages and areas that these critters could live in. This is the basic pollination syndrome character chart, which is a mouthful, but basically what it has are not all of them, but some of the different insects or animal pollinators that we described across the top. So we have the bats, the bees, the beetles, birds, butterflies, flies, and then even wind. So these are the ways that a lot of things are pollinated. And it tells you what either color, odor, shape, what time the plant blooms, and then if the nectar is there or where it's located to attract these different types of pollinator friends. So we're not going to go over all of this, but I just wanted to throw it in here for you guys to have for reference. So if you really are trying to, attract beetles, for example, they really like fruity and spicy smelling flowers. And they also like large bowl-shaped ones that they can crawl down into. So I think that's kind of cool. Somebody's done a lot of research to put all this chart together. So something fun for you to study after the class. Aroma is one of the main ways that animal pollinators are going to be attracted to your garden. So aroma is the way that the flower appeals to the critter that it's trying to attract. So if the critter doesn't like the way it smells, then they're not going to come into your yard and garden. Then we have different types of flowers, the flower parts that are going to be attractive to different types of animals. So you can see the bottom picture here is a bumblebee that has landed on part of the snapdragon flower. So it's actually big enough to pull the lower petals down, and it acts as a landing platform, and then it can actually get in there and get the pollen and nectar from that snapdragon. Some other types of flowers, a lot of our butterflies, they like things like Queen Anne's lace because they're so nice and large, and zinnias, anything in that Asteraceae family, because they give them a nice landing platform so they can land there and they can nectar without having to be, blown off or anything like that. Plant color, of course, is also very important to attracting pollinators. We know that hummingbirds, like red flowers. We talked about that already. And it just happens to be that red flowers have a lot of very rich carbohydrate nectar. So it makes sense that they would like to visit those red ones. They don't have to visit as many flowers that way. And this slide I just thought was really interesting about how insects do see things differently. We talked about this again with hummingbirds earlier, but how the UV light spectrum that they see, it actually makes things kind of glow. And I love this picture at the bottom of a black-eyed Susan, where what we see is on the left and what they see is on the right. So it's kind of like, arrows that are pointing them towards the nectar and towards the pollen. So that's kind of cool that what they see is a little bit different than what we're seeing. And it's important to remember to plant in drifts. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but a drift is basically whenever you put multiple colors of multiple flowers that have a similar color all together. Or you can plant large sections of the same plant in one area, and that just helps the pollinators to see them. So if they're flying by, they might kind of jump out to them a little bit more and say, oh, look, there's a pretty garden. There's a lot of flowers that I could visit and feed on. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
Hey, thanks, Ashley. So I am going to try and share my screen, and hopefully that'll work. Let me see. Okay. So Ashley, stay on here so I can make sure that you're seeing my presentation.
Yes, I see it so far.
Okay, do you see the side panel as well, like all the slides, or just the main slide?
No, we see everything.
You see everything, okay. So I will begin from this slide, but I have to go. Blah, 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 blah. How did I get there? Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
All right, right here. Okay. So thank you, Ashley. All right, so right now I wanted to focus on talking about how to attract butterflies to your yard and what kind of plants to have in your landscape that is going to meet the requirements for butterflies to reproduce, live, and thrive. So first thing we need to do is understand the life cycle of a butterfly, because at each life cycle stage, it has different requirements. So butterflies have a complete metamorphosis life cycle. So they go from egg to caterpillar or larva, and then to chrysalis, another word for that would be cocoon, and then to the adult stage. So as caterpillars in the larval stage, they oftentimes require a different plant as a food source than they do as adult butterflies. And while they're in a chrysalis during that stage, they don't eat, so they don't require anything at that time. So this is a nice little chart of, these are trees and other woody plants that are very beneficial to the supporting butterflies, and not only butterflies, but other insects. Especially in the mid-Atlantic region. So if you take a look at the chart, you'll see that oak supports 532 species of butterflies and moths. So that's pretty cool. And high up along with oak would be willow and cherry and birch, poplar, crabapple, blueberries, maple, alder, hickory, and elm, and the list goes on, and pine trees too. So this is just for your notes so that it can help you figure out what kind of stuff you'd like to plant in your yard, or if what you have in your yard is going to be a larval host plant or benefit butterflies. And also these would be some native herbaceous plants that also are great for supporting butterflies. And some of the common names would be goldenrod, aster, sunflower, Joe Pye weed, and you've got violets and black-eyed Susans, phlox, bee balm, just a whole list there to help you plan your garden. And you'll see in this picture that in this garden, they have incorporated a lot of different native herbaceous plants. They've also got some shrubs in the background and some grasses, and I can see some trees. So as Ashley was talking about, it's really important to stratify your habitat so that you include herbaceous plants as well as grasses, shrubs, and overstory and understory trees. Okay, so right now I want to focus on native host plants for the larval stage of butterflies. So we have a list of native trees and shrubs on the left and herbaceous plants on the right. So some trees that you might want to consider putting in your yard, or might be happy to know that they help native or help butterflies, would be aspen, birch, blueberry. This is in alphabetical order. Cherry, dogwood, elm, false indigo, locust, oak, pawpaw, spice bush, sassafras, tulip poplar, and willows. Willows actually support a lot of different butterflies. Some herbaceous plants that would be great to have in your garden would be aster, Dutchman's pipe. If you live up further north, you won't be able to grow this one. I believe it's either zone 6 or 5. False nettle, grasses and sedges, lupins, mallow, milkweed, all kinds of nettle species. And one of our participants grows nettles, and they have a lot of great uses to them. Passion flower, sneezeweed, trifolium, which would be clovers, and turtlehead, and violets. So you might not think about violets, but there's violets growing in your yard, which some people want to get rid of out of their lawn. They actually provide a larval food for various butterflies. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures of some of these native plants. And now Passiflora incarnata, or maypop, is a native passion flower, and it is a beautiful plant. I do believe it's supposed to be able to grow in zone 5 and higher, and it does actually produce a fruit that you can eat. But this particular vine is gorgeous. It is a larval host plant for the Gulf fritillary and also some zebra longwing species, and also the variegated fritillary. Now we have the beautiful, very showy plants that can be larval host plants that look great in your garden. And then we have some of the less glamorous plants that you would probably consider a weed, such as nettles. And these would be the urtica species. And yes, they do sting, but they are a larval host plant for the red admiral butterfly. And they do have a lot of great uses. Some people will make tea out of it for medicinal purposes. Also, you can eat it like a potter, boil it like spinach, and I think it tastes great. I've tried it. So if you're gonna grow this plant or handle it, make sure that you wear gloves when you handle it, because it does sting. But it is a great plant for wildlife and for humans. Okay, so some herbaceous non-native larval host plants for butterflies, which you probably have in your lawn if you're not keeping up with your weeding like me. I think half of my lawn is grass and the other half is all the rest of this stuff. So clover, fennel, hops, marigold, parsley, plantain, Queen Anne's lace, snapdragon, sorrel, stonecrop, vetch, and winter cress. These are non-native plants that are also larval hosts for several kinds of butterfly. So it's great if you have some clover and even some plantain in your yard. And And don't forget the violets, although they are native, but they do provide a source of food for caterpillars. So if you can stand it, leave them in there. Also, I don't think I'm not going to encourage vetch too much, but I mean because it can be very invasive. Vetch, there are some species that are less invasive than others, but certainly if you have an herb garden, you could put some parsley in there, and fennel, and maybe you're an avid beer brewer and you have hops. Well, just be aware that some butterflies are going to make use of that for the larval stage, and if you can, plant some extra and let them have some of your plants. You'll be helping them out. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the native nectar sources for butterflies. So native sources of nectar, which would be trees, shrubs, and vines, include eastern redbud, willow species, cherries, summer sweet, spice bush, rhododendron, New Jersey tea, trumpet honeysuckle, and trumpet vine. And I've got a few pictures here to show you. So this is trumpet vine or trumpet creeper. Hummingbirds also love this plant. This is a great larval host plant. It can be aggressive, and it's heavy. So you need to make sure you provide it with a good support in order for it to grow, and be careful where you place it. Okay, this is a picture of some eastern redbuds I took in St. Louis, Missouri, walking through a lovely park there, and all of the redbuds were in bloom. This is just a gorgeous tree. It's got to be one of my favorite trees, and it is a legume, and it does provide a food source for butterflies, for larvae. And this is a nice little shrub, summer sweet, or I always think of it as clethra. So if you're looking at a catalog for a nursery, or you go to visit a nursery, you should be able to find this plant, although it's probably going to be a hybrid. So, I mean, it's great if you can find the native species, and I encourage you to try and do that, but unfortunately they're a little less accessible than other ones. So if you have to, you can go with a hybrid of a native. Although I think Ashley mentioned earlier that hybrids and non-natives tend to not be as rich in nectar and pollen as the natives, but I think it's better to have that than some kind of invasive species. So summer sweet is a lovely plant, and it's a small shrub, only gets maybe 2.5, maybe 3 feet tall, and it does come in pink as well. All right, New Jersey tea. This is one of my favorites. This is a native. I grow this in my demonstration garden in Cumberland, Maryland, and you can see in the lower left-hand corner the picture of the plant before it has flowers, and then up there in the right-hand corner with flowers. Now, I planted this in the garden as a larval host plant, as well as the fact that you can make tea out of the leaves of this plant. And in fact, our colonists during the Revolutionary War resorted to using this while they were boycotting buying English tea. So it actually does have a pretty good flavor. That's just a little side note. I get excited about native plants. Okay, so here are some nectar sources we're going to talk about that are herbaceous, native herbaceous plants. And I'm sorry, what I was talking about before were nectar sources. I apologize. I got confused there. Called them larval host plants. Some of them may be. Some of these double as both larval host plants and sources of nectar and pollen. Some of them double, but okay. So we're going to focus now on herbaceous plants that are native and that provide nectar for the butterfly adults. Okay, so, and there's a whole big list here, and I don't need to read them all. And this is for, you can look back at this list when we send it out to you, and it will help you plan your garden. Maybe say, oh, hey, I've already got a lot of these. I'm doing pretty good. Or, hey, I need to, maybe take out some of these non-natives and try to incorporate some natives. So I think it's really important, as Ashley mentioned in the beginning, to make sure that you have plants available spring through fall. So For fall, some of the best plants that you could have would be aster and goldenrod, and let's see, Joe Pyeweed and ironweed. They are kind of towards the end of the summer, so include some of those. And in the spring, Columbine is a great one, Virginia bluebells. So just try and incorporate, you know, these native plants so that you have a nectar source spring through fall. So some other ones are beard tongue, bee balm, butterfly weed, black-eyed Susan, blanket flower, coreopsis, goldenrod, ironweed, Joe Pye, milkweed, all kinds of milkweed. We're going to talk about that. Phlox, purple coneflower, etc. All right, I'm going to show you some pictures of some of these, and you'll just see how beautiful they are. Now, there are all kinds of milkweeds, and they happen to be larval host plants and nectar sources for many different kinds of butterflies. And one that you might be particularly familiar with would be the monarch butterfly. So on the left we have butterfly weed, and this is a great one. It's not invasive at all. It's kind of small. It doesn't take over, and has pretty orange flowers, and the butterflies just love it, especially monarchs. I have it in my garden, and they lay eggs on it, and I get to see the caterpillars and the butterflies in my yard, so it's a wonderful thing. And then if you want a showy milkweed that's pink, swamp milkweed is great, although it does require moist conditions, so don't put it in a dry area of your yard, okay? Butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, does well in dry areas, whereas swamp milkweed needs to be in wet areas. Make sure you put the right plant in the right place so it'll be happy. Okay, this is a picture of common milkweed, and you can see the fritillaries enjoying the nectar there from those flowers. And this would be like the wild one you see so much of along the side of the roads. And it's great if you can incorporate that somewhere in your yard, but it will multiply, and you kind of have to keep it in check. Okay, another great source of nectar for butterflies that's a native is Anise hyssop, or Agastache funiculum. And this is in my demonstration garden in Cumberland, and the butterflies they cover this plant as well as bees. So this is a great one to add. Another would be anything in the penstemon family. This is a native called, this is Penstemon digitalis, so it's foxglove beard tongue, and the bees just love this one, butterflies too. Okay, Baptisia australis, which is false indigo, is another gorgeous plant. It does become like a small shrub. It gets larger every year. It's probably probably about 3 feet tall, and I think it's approaching 3 feet wide at this point in my garden. It's been there for about 3 years. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about individual butterflies and the particular plants that you should have in your yard, both to provide food for caterpillars and food for the adults. And I'm going to turn off my camera here for a little bit. All right, so the Baltimore checker spot is actually the state butterfly for Maryland. And unfortunately, it is struggling because of loss of habitat, and it is, I believe, endangered. But this beautiful butterfly needs to have Chelone glabra, which is turtlehead, white turtlehead, as its main host plant for its caterpillars. Now, with the decline of the availability of turtlehead in our natural habitats, the butterfly has turned to using some other plants, such as narrow-leaf plantain, hairy beard tongue, which is another penstemon, and false foxglove, as well as there's some evidence that it uses arrowwood viburnum. So if you can and you want to try and support this butterfly, try and put some of the white turtle head in your yard. But be aware that if you leave some of those plantains in your yard, in your grass, the checker spot might be able to make use of that. So for adult food, the butterfly uses the nectar from flowers of milkweed, viburnum, and wild rose. Okay, next one. All right, monarch. I think most people are familiar with the monarch, and you're probably aware that they depend on milkweed species for their larvae, and there are various kinds of milkweeds, which I pointed out to you. And monarch adults pretty well will collect nectar from just about any of the native herbaceous plants that we've talked about in this presentation. So they're pretty general in which plants they make use of as adult butterflies. Common buckeye. Now this is a beautiful butterfly. The larvae, or the caterpillars, require plants from the snapdragon family. And some other ones you might not be as familiar with would be toadflax or gerardia. They also feed on plants in the plantain family, such as the narrow-leaf plantain that I talked about. There's also a broadleaf plantain, so leave them in your yard. And the acanthus family, which includes the native wild petunia, Rheola humilis, which you can find in native plant catalogs. Okay, so the adults, their favorite nectar sources include aster, chicory, gumweed, knapweed, tickseed, sunflower, dogbane, peppermint, and other flowers are also visited. Okay, the eastern tiger swallowtail requires for its caterpillars wild cherry trees, sweet bay, which would be magnolia species, basswood, tulip trees, birch, ash, cottonwood, mountain ash, and willow. So you notice here that this caterpillar is making use of trees. So trees are a very important part of your landscape for providing food for butterflies. Okay, the adult will use wild cherry, lilac, milkweed, and Joe Pye weed as nectar sources. This is a painted lady. Its caterpillar is pretty general in the plants that it uses, and some of its favorites include those in the thistle family or aster family, hollyhock, mallow, and various different legume species. The adults will prefer to get their nectar from composite flowers, 3 to 6 feet tall. They especially like thistles, also asters, cosmos, blazing star, ironweed, Joe Pye weed. And they may also visit red clover, buttonbush, privet, and milkweeds. The red admiral is another beautiful butterfly. Its caterpillars depend on plants from the nettle family, which I showed you a picture of earlier. So it'd be great if you could include some of those somewhere in your landscape. They may possibly use hops, and hops is actually a very beautiful vining plant that you could use to cover a trellis, and it has some neat looking flowers, which of course is also used for making beer. So there's another plus. All right, the adult food for red admirals is the sap of trees. And they also like to visit fermenting fruit and bird droppings. So this is a little different, but they will also visit milkweeds, red clover, asters, and alfalfa. Okay, this is a fritillary, and this is one that I see often in my yard, the great spangled fritillary. It depends on violets for its caterpillars. So try and leave some violets in your yard. Also, the adults prefer to use milkweeds, thistle, ironweed, dogbane, mountain laurel, verbena, vetch, bergamot, red clover, Joe Pye weed, and purple coneflower. Okay, the silver spotted skipper, its caterpillars need legumes, which include black locust trees, honey locust, false indigo, which I showed you a picture of earlier. That's the one with the pretty blue flowers and is a native. Let's see, the adults will visit blue, red, pink, and purple flowers, maybe sometimes white. They don't seem to visit yellow flowers. So some flowers that they like to visit include common milkweed, red clover, buttonbush, blazing star, thistles, and everlasting pea. The spice bush swallowtail. This has a really cute caterpillar. I should have put it on here, but anyway, it's pretty funny looking. It looks like it's got 2 big eye spots, and it's one of the cutest caterpillars I've ever seen. But that caterpillar needs to have spice bush or sassafras trees, tulip tree, magnolia, camphor, and red bay for a food source. Now the adults, in turn, will visit Japanese honeysuckle, jewelweed, thistles, milkweed, azalea, dogbane, lantana, which is a common nursery plant, annual, mimosa, and sweet pepper bush. Okay, finally, I wanted to show you at least one moth here because moths are important pollinators. They tend to do their pollinating at night. They visit flowers that are going to stand out at night, so those are generally white flowers. And the caterpillar host plants that are necessary are white birch, persimmon, sweet gum, hickory trees, various species, walnuts, and sumacs. And the adults do not feed. Okay, so here's a picture of my native plant garden at the Extension Office in Allegheny County. And you can see I've tried to incorporate a lot of different native herbaceous plants. I do have one shrub in there. I have a non-native, oh gosh, I can't think of it. Anyway, I'll come back to that. And you can see the purple flowers on the right-hand side. That's the anise hyssop and a bunch of purple coneflowers in the front, which the bees love. And in the center of the picture, you might be able to see this silver plant. That is lamb's ear. And that is not a nectar source or a food source for larvae, but carder bees love this plant, and they actually collect the fuzz off of these leaves and use it in making their nests. So I like to leave that plant in there. Lilac is the name of the bush. So no, that's not native, but it does provide a larval, or not a larval, well, yeah, for some, larval host, and also it provides nectar for butterflies. Okay, so we just like to mention this, that you be aware that some plants in your yard can actually be harmful because they can be invasive, and they may actually, sometimes they can pull insects away from native plants because they happen to be showier, but they don't provide as good a nutrition as your native plants. So some non-natives to avoid in your yard would be garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, purple loosestrife. Some shrubs would be Japanese barberry, which birds eat the seeds and reproduce. They reproduce all over the place wherever the birds drop their waste. Bush honeysuckle, which is very invasive, multiflora rose, autumn olive, and Japanese spirea. Those shrubs are all very invasive. Some trees to avoid would be Bradford pear, Norway maple, white mulberry, and tree of heaven. Also invasive. And vines would include Japanese honeysuckle, oriental bittersweet, English ivy, periwinkle, Japanese wisteria, and porcelain berry. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a web link for a great book and other information about plant invaders of the mid-Atlantic natural areas to help you avoid placing these kinds of plants in your yard. This is also a great reference. It will help you to figure out what plants to place in your landscape for pollinators. So if you want, you can check that booklet out, and there's the website for it at the bottom of the page. Also, you may wonder, where in the world can I get some of these native plants? So we've included a few sources for you. Prairie Moon is a resource I've used frequently and have had good luck with them. They sell plants as well as seeds via mail order. Wood Thrush Native Plant Nursery in Floyd, Virginia is an actual brick and mortar store you can go and visit. There's also one in Lancaster, PA, Go Native Tree Farm. I do believe there's one in Baltimore. I'll have to look that one up. If you live in Garrett or Allegheny County in Maryland, your local source would be the Evergreen Heritage Center in Mount Savage, Maryland. Okay, so for more information, you can check out the Maryland Native Plant Society or the National Wildlife Federation. That's a great resource. Native Plant Center, butterfliesandmoths.org. Wildflower.org is actually it's a place in Texas that was started by Lady Bird Johnson. So that's a great resource as well. And then a resource that I use all the time is this guide that you can download. You can get it online from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on native plants for wildlife habitat for the Chesapeake Bay watershed area. So it lists all these different native plants from grasses to vines, shrubs, trees, herbaceous plants, and tells you what kind of conditions they need to live in, whether they need to live in a wet area or a dry area, what they look like, and what if they're beneficial to birds or other wildlife or pollinators. So it's a really great resource. Okay.
And Sherry, before people log off, I just wanted to throw up our poll questions real quick. So if you guys would, please go ahead and answer these polling questions for us. We would appreciate it. We thank y'all for hanging out with us this afternoon. If you guys have questions, please enter them into the chat. You guys have had a lot of great thoughts in the chat. Sherry, we did have one question about deer eating the white turtlehead. Isn't that part of the problem of why there's some issues with them?
Yeah, it's definitely the problem. Deer do like to eat it. That's one of the reasons why, we're losing this plant in our natural habitats. So I have some turtlehead planted in my yard, and I don't have it completely fenced off. So sometimes the deer visit my yard and they do eat the turtlehead. So yeah, you might have to put some kind of fencing around it or something to protect it from the deer.
Okay, thank you. Just to reiterate, we definitely will be sending out the PDF of the slides in the next couple days, as well as the recording. So we had 78% of people go ahead and answer the poll, so we're going to go ahead and close it. Thank you all for your participation. We appreciate the feedback very much.
Yep.
And Sherry, do you have anything else? I think it was a great presentation, and I thank everyone for their interest.
Yeah, definitely. It's fun. It's always fun to talk about pollinators and native plants. So we appreciate you joining us all. And once again, we will be sending out an email that will include a PDF of this presentation. So you'll be able to see the lists of plants and also all those resources at the end. And this has been recorded, so you'll be able to find it at our YouTube channel, which is University of Maryland Extension, Western Cluster, and it's under horticulture, right, Ashley?
Yes, home horticulture, yep.
Home
Our
horticulture.
playlist.
Okay.
And I will stick if anybody's interested in our class next week for natural ways to manage pests and diseases in your landscape, I will drop that into the chat box. And
will be emailed to you because we have, since you're a participant, we have your email. So
yes, we'll be emailing the PDF, yes. All right, I'll go ahead and stick our email addresses in here one more time. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us individually, or if we missed something in the chat, we can follow up with you individually very happily. So,
Yep.
all right. Anything else, Sherry?
No, I think that's it.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording.